We already used several videos to explain what Adam Smith found to be the driving forces of economic development. Now, in this video, we're gonna, it's the next step of our academic journey, which would be led by another great thinker and a political economist, and his name is David Ricardo. Okay? And he is a very classical British economist. Okay? And in his book called The Principles of Political Economy and Taxation, he mentioned another important driving force of development, which is international trade. Okay? Now here we call this the third driving force. After saving and the extension of market. Okay, and here let's first talk about in theory how does it work. In other words, how does international trade promote economic prosperity? We're going to discuss two different channels. Okay, and the first channel is something we actually discussed in the previous video. Okay, the international trade could promote the extension of markets. Okay, in other words, the markets could be extended across the national borders. Okay, if you recall what we discussed in the previous videos, when we talk about Adam Smith, what he mentioned is actually, the market could be extended domestically. Okay? In other words, if the nation has a relatively large national market, okay? In other words, the market is not segmented, it's not separated across the regions of the nation. If there's a kind of the unified national market for productive resources like labor and for the final outputs, then the country is more likely to experience economic prosperity. Okay? But here, different from Smith, David Ricardo focused more upon the international extension of markets. Okay? And he said because of that, there could be further specialization or division of labor. Okay? And this, here, it's going to take place across nations, okay, not within one nation. And he believes that every country could find a comparative advantage of its productive resources, okay, what they are better at, okay, and so that they can focus upon producing that product, okay, and then we could achieve a higher worker productivity across nations. Okay? And eventually, this will lead to the greater economic prosperity. Okay? So logically, this should be easy, okay? Given that what we already learned from the introductory course, okay, about the comparative advantage. But here to help you refresh your memory or even deepen your understanding of comparative advantage, we would raise two questions. I'm going to come back to this, or we can talk about this here. What we explained here is a peaceful way to extend the market across the border. In other words, there is an unpeaceful way, right? That means you can, send your military and occupy the territory of another country. Okay, in other words, we're talking about here the colonialization or the colonial history. Okay, and later this semester when we talk about some Asian economies, the colonial history is definitely a very important piece of the puzzles which will help us understand, the cultural background, the historical background for their economic development. Okay, but I guess today in 21st century, unless you're Vladimir Putin, there's no kind of no way to occupy another country, right? Or even a piece of land from another country. So again, for most cases we're talking about here, it's just a peaceful way through the international trade to extend the market. Okay. Now, speaking of the comparative advantage here, I would like to leave two questions for you guys to think about. Okay. Does every economy has its absolute advantage? Does every economy has its comparative advantage? Okay. Of course, to be able to answer these two questions, you need to have a good understanding of these two concepts: absolute advantage and comparative advantage. Okay. If you feel like you already put this behind you, you should go and Google it or go back and look at the notes from your introductory course and pick them up. Okay. And once you intuitively understand these two questions, or will be able to answer these two questions, you can go ahead and try the in-class worksheet number 4. Okay, there will be one question over there, a numerical questions, which will help you better understand the differences between these two types of advantages. Okay. All right. Now, about the how international trade could promote economic development, we also have some empirical evidence here to show that Asia's share of world trade and world GDP. Okay, so on your left-hand side, it's a percent of the world trade that Asia or emerging Asia could account for. As we said before, emerging Asia means, in the past few decades, these Asian economies experienced a relatively high economic growth rate. Okay, for example, China, India, Indonesia, Thailand, these economies. Okay, they experienced a high or faster growth than other regions across the world, but these economies have not yet achieved the high level of income, which usually defined as $20,000 per person. Okay, so that's why they're called emerging Asia. Okay, as you can see that when on the right hand side of this figure, when the Asian economies are catching up, they're experiencing a faster growing. Okay, in the past half a century. Okay, and we also find that they heavily or more involved in global trade. Okay, so you can see that back in 1970s, Asia as a whole accounts for about 12% of the world trade. Okay, and in 2030, which is projected projection data, this share would be more than 25%. In other words, more than a quarter of global trade. Okay, and you find that emerging Asia, follow the same trend as well. Okay, and even like when we look at their GDP share in the global GDP, it could be flattened, being evened between 2000 and 2030, but again, they will still have a growing share of the global GDP. I'm sorry, the global trade. Okay. Again, later we're going to talk about these. No matter when we look at Japan or China or Asian tigers, these economies actually benefited a lot from their exporting industries. Okay. Sometimes we would call these is export-led economic growth. Okay. In other words, what happened in these countries is their exported industries or sectors boomed in the first place, which kind of spill over to the other sectors, domestic sectors, and lead them to a higher level of efficiency or productivity. So again, actively involved or engaged in the world trade is quite important when we look at the Asian economic miracle. Okay, all right, and so this is the first channel through which international trade could promote economic growth. Okay, again, the key is the specialization of labor. Okay, and the comparative versus absolute advantage. Okay, and in the next video, we're gonna talk about the second channel through which international trade could promote long-term sustainable growth.